The Veil Fairy did not grieve the way humans did. There were no funerals. No flowers placed on cold stone. No gathering of bodies in a hall to share stories over food and drink. When a Veil Fairy died, they were returned to the root soil of their home world, Delos Prime, and a single ceremonial flame was extinguished in the family's central chamber. That was all. The extinction of light. The ending of warmth. Princess Sorvith Velkareth had watched that flame go out 14 months ago. She had not smiled since. This was not metaphor. The Veil Fairy were a species whose emotional states were partially bioluminescent. The faint phosphorescent tracery that ran beneath the skin of their faces, branching like frost across glass, would respond to emotional stimulus. Joy produced a slow gold pulse. Grief produced nothing. Not darkness. Just an absence of light, which was somehow worse. Sorvitha's face had been dark for 14 months. She stood now at the observation deck of the GCU Meridian Accord, a diplomatic vessel roughly the size of a small city, and watched the stars pass with the flat, careful attention of someone who had learned to make their face into a wall. She was 26 years old by Veil Fairy reckoning, which translated to approximately 31 Earth years, and she was already the most powerful political figure in the Outer Reaches Compact, because her father was dead and there was no one else. Emperor Kareth Vel Sorvith, the inversion of the naming structure was intentional, the child carries the father's name forward, had been the architect of the compact. 40 years of his life spent threading together 6 species, 11 star systems, and 300 years of mutual suspicion into something that barely held. He had died not in battle and not in ceremony. He had died of a cardiac event in his private quarters on a Tuesday, which struck Sorvith as the cruelest possible thing the universe could have arranged. There was no dignity in Tuesday. No poetry in a Tuesday morning. She had been on the other side of the station when it happened. She had not made it in time. The Meridian Accord was en route to the Kirin Station Summit, where the Compact's 6-member species would negotiate resource rights in the newly opened Delanthi Corridor. It was exactly the kind of work her father had spent his life doing. It was exactly the kind of work Sorvith had spent her life training for and quietly dreading. She had always imagined doing it beside him. Learning from him. Having another decade at least before the weight of it transferred to her shoulders alone. She had not been given a decade. Your Highness. The voice behind her belonged to Councillor Thevrak, her senior diplomatic advisor and, in practical terms, the person who kept her from making catastrophic errors in the first months after her ascension. He was an older Veil Fairy, silver-traced and careful. We are 3 hours from Kirin Station. The preliminary briefings are assembled. I know, she said. The human delegation arrived yesterday, he added. Ambassador Reyes and his team. They've requested a preliminary meeting before the formal summit opens. The humans always want a preliminary meeting, she said. They don't trust formal settings. They think informality is a form of honesty. Is that a criticism? She considered it. No, she said. I think they might be right. I just find it exhausting. Thevrak said nothing for a moment. He was good at silence. Your father thought highly of the humans, he said finally. He said they had an instinct for the moment when a negotiation needed to stop being a negotiation. He said a great many things about the humans. She turned from the window. Her face gave nothing. Schedule the preliminary meeting. 1 hour after docking. She walked back through the corridor toward her chambers, and the stars moved behind her through the viewport, indifferent and cold, and the phosphorescent traces beneath her skin remained dark. The human delegation occupied a mid-tier suite on Kirin Station's diplomatic ring. It was not the largest suite, that belonged to the Veil Fairy contingent, and it was not the most strategically located. But it had good sight lines to 3 corridor junctions, which the advance team had noted appreciatively, because humans were, as a species, quietly and almost unconsciously tactical about their environments. Corporal Davan Osei Mensa was not technically part of the diplomatic delegation. He was security. Third-tier security, meaning he stood outside doors and walked perimeters and wrote reports that no one read. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered in the particular way that suggested he had spent a significant portion of his life moving heavy things, and he had a face that people tended to describe as honest, which was another way of saying it showed everything he was thinking. He had been assigned to Kirin Station for 6 weeks. He had never met an alien before this assignment. In the week since arriving, he had met 4 species and managed to embarrass himself with each of them in a different and educational way. With the Veil Fairy, he had made the error of direct eye contact during a formal introduction, not understanding that among their people sustained eye contact from a subordinate to a superior was a form of challenge. Ambassador Reyes had corrected him quietly afterward. Davin had spent the next 2 days cringing every time he walked past a Veil Fairy corridor. He was standing his post outside conference room 7C when the Veil Fairy princess arrived for the preliminary meeting. He had seen images. Briefings included photographs of all major diplomatic figures, and the Veil Fairy were striking enough that they tended to stay in memory. Tall, pale to the point of translucency, with that faint phosphorescent branching beneath the skin that the briefing materials had described as a biological emotional indicator. The princess was notable in the photographs because the branching in her face was always dark. Every photograph. 14 months of public record without a single glow. He thought he understood what that meant. He had read about her father. What he was not prepared for was how young she looked in person. Photographs had conveyed authority. Standing in front of him, waiting for the conference room doors to open, she looked like someone carrying something very heavy for a very long time who had learned to stand perfectly straight so no one could see the effort. He recognized that. He had seen it on his mother's face for 3 years after his father died. He did not say anything. He was security. His job was to not say anything. But he met her eyes, not with the direct challenge gaze that the briefing had warned against, but with the brief, involuntary acknowledgement of one person who recognizes grief in another, and then he looked away, because that was correct and professional, and he opened the conference room door and held it because that was his job. She paused. Just briefly. Half a step. The kind of pause that might mean nothing. Then she walked through the door, and her face was still dark, and the meeting began. But she had paused. The preliminary meeting lasted 90 minutes. Ambassador Elena Reyes had been in diplomatic service for 22 years and had negotiated with 4 non-human species and 17 human governments, which she maintained was harder. She was compact, methodical, and possessed of the particular stillness that comes from having learned, through long experience, that the most useful thing you can do in most meetings is listen. She watched Princess Sorvath across the table and thought, this person is not here yet. Sorvath was present in the technical sense. She asked precise questions about the Delanthi corridor survey data. She correctly identified the resource allocation framework that the Chiron hosts had proposed as a quiet attempt to favor the Terahic member systems at the expense of the Veil Fairy outer holdings. She accepted a correction from Councillor Thevrak on a procedural point with more grace than most heads of state half again her age would have managed. But she was not here. Some core part of her was somewhere else, standing in a room watching a flame go out, and the rest of her was simply very good at her job. Reyes knew the shape of that absence. She had worn it herself, for a while, after her brother died. The way grief doesn't stop you from functioning, it just moves into the background and operates like a second climate, colder than everything else, running beneath the normal temperature of your days. The meeting ended without incident. Positions were noted. A framework for the first formal session was agreed upon. The Veil Fairy delegation filed out with the particular graceful economy of movement their species seemed to produce as a default. Reyes lingered, reading through her notes. "She's good," said Lieutenant Mara Okonkwo from the doorway, which was the highest compliment she generally offered. "She's grieving," said Reyes. "The two aren't mutually exclusive." "No," Reyes agreed. "But it costs more." Outside conference room 7C, Davinose Mensa was back at his post. He was eating an energy bar, his second of the shift, which he would later justify in his own mental accounting as necessary because he had skipped breakfast, and reading a physical paperback novel, which he had smuggled onto the station inside a climate-rated gear case because the station's digital lending system had a 4-day queue. The Veil Theory counselor emerged first, stopped, and regarded the novel with an expression that Davin was beginning to recognize as curiosity masquerading as disapproval. "You are reading," said Counselor Thevrak. "Yes, sir." Davin folded the book against his thigh. "I can put it away." "What is it?" He showed the cover. "It's about the first human expedition to one of the moons of Jupiter. It's fiction, but the author got most of the science right. I like when fiction does that." Thevrak looked at it for a moment longer. "The Veil Theory have a form they call Thelveric. It is narrative, like your fiction. But it is considered a diminished form. Literature of consequence does not invent what can be observed." "That's interesting," said Davin, genuinely. "I think humans invented fiction partly because we needed to practice emotions before we had to use them for real. Like a training exercise." Thevrak's expression shifted slightly. "That," he said after a pause, "is an unexpectedly precise observation." He moved on. Princess Sorvith came out of the conference room last, and she was already looking at her data pad, which was standard for someone moving between back-to-back engagements, and she was moving at the efficient pace of someone with a schedule, and she would have passed by in 3 seconds without incident. Except she wasn't looking at the data pad. Not really. Davin could see her eyes. They were focused about 6 inches in front of the screen. She was somewhere else. She walked directly into the small service cart that the maintenance crew had left against the corridor wall. It was a quiet collision. Not dramatic. The cart shifted, a water container rocked, and Sorvith stopped, looked at the cart with an expression that suggested she was calculating its offense against her, and then did something that surprised him. She picked up the container that had fallen to the floor and set it back on the cart. He had half moved to do it himself, and now he was standing there with the forward lean of someone who had started an action and cancelled it mid-sequence, and she looked at him, and he said, without planning to. "Long meeting." There was a pause. He immediately regretted it. "You did not comment on the fatigue of heads of state." That was not in the briefing materials because it didn't need to be in the briefing materials. It was obvious. But she said, "They all are." Not dismissive. Not warm. Just accurate, the way you are accurate with someone who has asked a genuine question. He nodded. She walked on. That night, writing up the absolutely uneventful security report for his shift, Davin Mensa spent longer than necessary on the sentence, "No incidents to report." Kirin Station never fully slept, but it had rhythms. Between 0200 and 0500 in the station's standardized time, the diplomatic ring went quiet. Delegations returned to their suites. Shared spaces emptied. The ambient hum of the ventilation system became the loudest thing in most corridors, which meant if you were walking alone, you could hear your own footsteps, and there was something in that, in the sound of your own movement in an empty space, that could be either peaceful or unbearable, depending on the night. Sorvith had not been sleeping well since her father died. This was not a secret within her delegation. Thevrak knew. Her personal aide knew. The ship's medical officer had offered interventions twice, and twice she had declined, not because she thought they would not work, but because she had a vague and possibly irrational feeling that sleep produced by chemistry was not the same as rest. So she walked. She had done this on the ship. She did it here. Late enough that the corridors were empty, early enough that she would not have to explain herself to anyone who mattered. She moved through Kirin Station's diplomatic ring in her civilian clothes, a formal tunic by most species standards, but without the insignia that made her a symbol rather than a person, and she let herself be somewhere where no one was watching. She was passing the observation alcove on level 7 when she heard the sound. It was quiet. Understated enough that she almost dismissed it. But she had good ears, and the corridor was genuinely silent, and what she heard was unmistakably someone breathing in the controlled way of a person who was not entirely all right. She stopped. The alcove was a small recessed space with a viewport angled to show the station's external structure and, beyond it, open space. The kind of space designed for one or two people to sit and have a moment of perspective. At 0300, it was supposed to be empty. Corporal David Osei Mensah was sitting on the bench inside it with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and his eyes on the viewport, and he was doing the breathing of someone who has learned not to make noise when things are difficult. He heard her stop. He looked up. She could see immediately that he had been crying recently. Humans showed it differently than Veiltheri, the redness around the eyes, the particular quality of the face immediately after, but she had been studying human expressions for the past 4 months because her role required her to work with them and she did not like being caught off guard by information. He straightened, and she could see him cycling through options: dismiss it, apologize for occupying the space, pretend nothing was happening. She came and sat at the other end of the bench. She did not say anything. She looked at the viewport. The station's external frame was lit against the dark, all angles and cable runs and the distant stars that didn't care. A long moment passed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'll move." "You don't need to move," she said. Silence. "Your briefing says you're from Ghana," she said. "Originally. My parents are," he said. "I grew up on Titan Station." She nodded. "Your father died," she said. Not a question. She had read the personnel files because she read everything, and she had noted the detail because at the time she had filed it as relevant background and later had found herself returning to it for reasons she hadn't examined closely. He looked at her. 3 years ago. Yeah. How long before you could sleep through the night? He was quiet for a moment. Honestly? About 18 months. And then only sometimes. She did not respond to that. She just sat with it. He said, carefully, "I read that your father built the compact." "He did. And now you're finishing the work." "I'm attempting to." Another long pause. Outside, a maintenance drone moved along the station's frame, small and methodical, doing its one job in the dark. "My dad was a structural engineer," Davin said. "He designed load-bearing systems. The kind of things that keep big structures from collapsing. He always said the hardest part wasn't the design. It was that the structure never thanked you. It just kept standing." Sorvath looked at him. "I think about that a lot," he said. "When I think about what he built." She held that for a moment. Then she looked back at the viewport. "My father said something similar," she said. "He said the compact would outlive him by centuries if it held at all, and he would receive no credit for it, and that was entirely correct, because the measure of it was that it shouldn't need anyone to hold it up." She paused. "He was wrong about the credit," she said. "I have given him quite a lot of it in my own mind." Davin made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. More like the cousin of one. She looked at him. And she almost said something that could have been the beginning of a smile. The facial muscles made a preliminary movement in that direction, and then it did not quite arrive, and she looked back at the stars. But almost. They sat there for another 20 minutes without speaking, and at the end of it she stood and said good night in formal galactic common and walked back to her suite, and he sat for a while longer, and the stars did not change, but the breathing that had brought her to stop in the first place had gone back to normal. There was a ritual in the human section of Kieran Station that the other delegations had noted and variously described as strange, wasteful, endearing, and characteristically irrational. Every morning, at approximately 0730, someone in the human delegation made coffee. Not synthesized coffee, which the station provided in perfectly calibrated beverage dispensers on every floor. Actual coffee, from grounds, using a manual press that Ambassador Reyes had brought in her personal luggage. The process took 11 minutes. The smell of it, which the ventilation system did not entirely contain, spread to the 3 adjacent suites. The Torati representative had formally complained. The complaint had been logged, reviewed, and quietly shelved. Sorvith had smelled it the second morning and found herself standing in the corridor outside the human delegation's common room, which was unusual, because she had not planned to be there. She had mentioned it to Thevrak, who had provided her with the relevant cultural context. Coffee was not simply a beverage. It was a transition ritual. It marked the boundary between sleep and wakefulness, between private and public self. The manual preparation was, for many humans, a meditative act. She had not gone in. But on the fourth day, she was passing through the corridor at 0731, which was 11 minutes later than her usual route, and the door of the human common room was partially open, and Corporal Osei was sitting at the small table inside with 2 cups, because he had, at some point, made a second. He looked up and saw her. He did not say anything immediately, which she was beginning to understand was something he was good at, making space without filling it. "I'm not sure your cultural practice of hospitality requires you to make a second cup for a possible passerby," she said from the doorway. "It doesn't," he agreed. "I just usually make 2. It's a habit." She looked at the cup. She had tried synthesized coffee once and found it bitter and without complexity. She did not know if the same would be true of the real thing. "May I come in?" she asked. He gestured at the seat across from him. She sat down. He pushed the second cup toward her. She picked it up. It was warm in a way that the synthesized drinks were not, holding heat unevenly through the ceramic, and she drank. It was bitter. It was also complex. Several things at once, which she had not expected. "It's not sweet," she observed. "Do you want sugar?" "I have some." "No," she said. "I think I prefer it honest." Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement. The precursor of amusement. They sat. Outside the viewport of the common room, the Delanthe corridor star field was visible, pale and dense. "The session today will be difficult," she said. It was not an invitation to discuss it. More like a statement made to a room she happened to be sharing. "The resource allocation," he said. She looked at him. "You follow the proceedings?" "I read the briefings," he said. "I know it's not my level to follow them. But I like to understand where I am." She considered that. "The Tora T block is positioning for majority control of the Helyen extraction sites. My father spent 11 years preventing that. If it passes in this summit, it undoes the framework of the entire Delanthe agreement." He was quiet for a moment. "What does your delegation need to make that not happen?" "The Akath to hold their current position," she said. "They're wavering. The Tora T have offered them secondary extraction rights as a side arrangement, which the Akath representative, Councillor Sotharn, is inclined to accept because he is pragmatic and slightly afraid of the Tora T and not yet convinced that the Compact's protections are reliable." "What would convince him?" "Evidence," she said. "Precedent. A demonstration that the Compact has held before under similar pressure." He was looking at the table, not at her, which she had learned meant he was thinking rather than disengaging. "The Outer Drell Agreement," he said. She looked at him. 2247, he said. "The Compact held against the Yeneth Sovereignty's resource claim on the Drell stations. It went to arbitration and the Compact's framework held all 6 member positions. Sotharn was a junior counselor in the Akath delegation at the time. He was there." She set down the cup. "How do you know that?" she asked. "The briefing packet," he said. "It has a biographical appendix. I read the whole thing." There was a silence. She picked up the cup again. "I will ask Ambassador Reyes to reference the Drell precedent in this morning's session," she said. "She'll have thought of it already," he said. "She reads everything too." "Good," said Sorvith. She finished the coffee. It was bitter to the last and warm all the way through. She set the cup down carefully. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee or the briefing packet?" "Both," she said. She walked out into the corridor, and the door closed behind her, and Davin Mensa sat for a moment with the two empty cups in front of him and the feeling that the morning had been subtly different from other mornings in a way he was going to spend the rest of the day trying to account for. The formal sessions of the Delancey Corridor Summit were archived. Everything said in the chambers was recorded, transcribed, translated into 11 languages, cross-referenced against existing compact treaties, and stored in the central diplomatic record. This was standard. It was one of the things that made the compact function, an insistence on transparency in formal proceedings that created accountability even when the politics were raw. What was not recorded was everything that happened in the corridors. On the third day of formal sessions, the Torah T bloc made their formal resource proposal. It was technically compliant with the compact's framework in the way that a loophole is technically compliant with the spirit of the law. Ambassador Reyes, as expected, referenced the Drell precedent in her counter-framing. Councillor Sotharn of the Akath, who had been visibly uncertain in the first two sessions, asked 3 careful questions about the Drell arbitration mechanism, and by the afternoon he had shifted his delegation's position back to alignment with the compact's original framework. The Torah T proposal failed by 1 vote. This was how diplomacy worked. Not in great dramatic speeches. In the accumulation of small pressures applied in the right places. Sorvath did not smile in the chamber when the vote was called. She acknowledged the result with a formal statement that referenced her father's original framework document and expressed confidence in the compact's continued function. It was correct and it was measured and it gave nothing to the Torah T bloc's representatives to leverage in the next session. But outside the chamber, in the corridor, waiting for Thevrak to complete a brief procedural conversation with the session's administrative staff, she found herself standing near a viewport that showed the Delancey Corridor star field, and she thought, he would have been pleased with this. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just pleased, in the quiet way he had been pleased when things worked. She was standing there thinking this when she became aware of Davin passing through the corridor on a routine perimeter check. He caught her eye. He did not say anything. But he made a small gesture, a brief, understated movement of one hand that was not quite a wave and not quite a salute and was perhaps the physical equivalent of the word acknowledged. She found herself thinking about what it meant that he read the entire briefing packet, including the biographical appendix. She found herself thinking about the corridor at 0300, and the way he had not tried to fix anything or say the right words, but had just been present in the dark. She found herself thinking about 2 cups. She filed these thoughts under a category she did not have a label for yet, and she went back to work. That evening, in the human delegation's common room, Davin wrote a letter to his mother. He did this every 2 weeks when the relay allowed it. He wrote about the station, the negotiations he wasn't allowed to describe in detail but could reference obliquely, the 4 alien species he had now interacted with in a professional capacity. He wrote about the veil theory, carefully, because he was aware his mother would hear things in the spaces between what he said. He wrote, "There is a person here who is doing a very hard job in a very quiet way. I don't think anyone is telling her that she's doing it well. I think the job requires that no one does. I think she understands that. I don't know if understanding something makes it easier to carry." He read it back and then added, "She drinks coffee without sugar and she says she prefers things honest. I think that's the most accurate description of her I have." He sent the letter. His mother would write back in 10 days. She would not comment on the last paragraph. She never commented on the parts she found most significant. She would ask him if he was eating properly and whether his boots fit right and whether he had found the books he liked. He was already looking forward to the reply. On the 5th day, someone tried to kill Princess Sorvath. The word "tried" is doing significant work in that sentence. What happened was that a Torah T intelligence operative, later identified as acting without official sanction from the Torah T bloc delegation, a claim that was almost certainly true and entirely irrelevant, disabled a section of the corridor's atmosphere regulation system and introduced a neurotoxic compound into the ventilation of Sorvath's suite during the pre-dawn hours. The attempt failed for several reasons. The first was that Sorvath was not in her suite, because she was, as had become her habit, walking the corridors at 0300. The second was that Kieran Station's security systems detected the compound within 4 minutes of introduction. The third was that Corporal Davin Osei-Mensah, who happened to be on the corridor outside the human delegation's wing at the relevant time, heard the override signal from his earpiece indicating an atmospheric event in the Valeferry suite, and moved. He was not supposed to cross into the Valeferry delegation's secured zone. That was not his jurisdiction. His area of responsibility was the human diplomatic wing, and he was supposed to remain there and leave interdelegation security responses to the station's own security force. He did not remain there. He found Sorvath in the level 7 corridor, their corridor now, the one with the observation alcove, and he said, very calmly, "Your suite has been compromised. I need you to come with me." She looked at him. "What kind of compromise?" "Atmospheric. Do not go back there. Come with me now." She went. Later, she would note in her personal record that she had, without hesitation, followed a junior security corporal from another species delegation through 3 corridors and into a secured human anteroom because he had used the right tone. Not commanding. Not panicked. Simply present and certain, the way you are when you have made a decision and the decision is correct. In the anteroom, Davin communicated with the station's security team through his earpiece, relayed Sorvath's status to both delegations, and simultaneously confirmed that Thevrak and the rest of the Valeferry delegation were secured in the alternate suite that Kieran Station's emergency protocols required all delegations to have available. Through this entire process, he was completely calm. Sorvath watched this. She had seen calm in crisis before. Her father had possessed it, the kind of steadiness that came from deep experience. She had also seen the performed calm of people who were controlling their fear with significant effort. What she was watching was neither. This was something she had no precise word for in her language, the equanimity of a person who was afraid and had decided the fear could wait. When the immediate situation was stabilized, when the station security had the operative in custody and the suite was confirmed safe and Thevrak had been briefed, Davin sat down on the bench in the anteroom and let out a single long breath. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked up. He appeared to find the question slightly unexpected, as if he had not considered that it applied to him. "Yeah," he said. "Are you?" "I was not in the suite," she said. "Because I walk." "I know," he said. "I've seen you." She looked at him for a moment. "You crossed into the Valeferry security zone." "Yes." "That will create a report. It may create a disciplinary issue." "Probably," he said. "Why did you do it?" He seemed to consider several answers. He settled on, "I didn't think about it." "That's not an answer." "It's the true one," he said. "I heard the signal and I knew where you'd be and I moved. I'll think about whether that was correct later." In the moment there wasn't space for it. She was quiet. "Thank you," she said, and the word carried weight, the way it had when she said it over the empty coffee cups, but more. He nodded. They sat in the anteroom for another 10 minutes while the security team completed their assessment, and neither of them said anything, and the silence was not empty. That evening, the Torah T Block's lead representative formally disavowed any connection to the incident. The diplomatic record reflected the disavowal. What the record did not reflect was the private meeting that Ambassador Reyes and Sorvath held afterward, in which Reyes said, carefully, that the incident had resolved one open question in the summit. "Which question?" Sorvath asked. "Whether the compact would hold under pressure," Reyes said. "The answer appears to be yes." The Akath, the Sivathi, and the Helm delegations all sent formal statements of solidarity within the hour. The attempted destabilization destabilized only the party that attempted it. Sorvath was quiet for a moment. "My father would have found that satisfying." "So should you," Reyes said. "You built this result." "We all built it," Sorvath said. She paused. "Your Corporal Osei-Mensah will likely face a disciplinary review for crossing into our secured zone." "He will," Reyes agreed. "I would like to submit a formal statement on his behalf," Sorvath said. If that is procedurally appropriate. Reyes looked at her for a moment. It is, she said. I'll send you the form. The summit concluded on day 7. The Delancey Corridor Resource Agreement was signed in the formal chamber by all 6 member delegations. The photographs, because the Compact's Public Affairs Office believed in documentation, showed the representatives arranged by protocol at the long curved table, signatures applied to the digital record, the moment preserved. In the photographs, Princess Sorvith Vel Caratha's face was composed and formal, which was exactly right, and the phosphorescent traces beneath her skin were quiet, which was what they had been for 14 months. The closing reception was held in Kirin Station's main atrium, a large open space with good engineering and mediocre art. The ventilation worked correctly, the catering was calibrated to 6 species dietary requirements, and the conversations were the winding down kind, cordial, retrospective, people putting down the weight of a high-stakes week and beginning to feel the distance they were about to travel. Davin Osei-Mensah was not technically supposed to be at the reception. He was security. Security stood outside. He was there because Ambassador Reyes had, at the end of the last day, said, Osei-Mensah, the formal events conclude at 2100. The reception is a civilian gathering. You're off shift at 2000. The implication was clear enough. He stood near the edge of the atrium with a drink he was not particularly focused on, watching the assembled diplomats navigate the complex choreography of formal leave-taking. He saw Sorvith on the other side of the room. She was speaking to Councillor Sotharn of the Akath, which was the correct political conversation to be having. The Akath were the delegation that needed the most maintenance going forward, and Sorvith was doing what her father had spent 40 years doing, threading the relationship forward past this moment. She was also, he noticed, tired. Not in her posture was correct and controlled, but in her eyes, in the small things that you only see if you have been watching closely for a week. He did not go to her. That was not what you did. The week was ending. The work had been done. They would go back to their separate parts of the universe, and that was the correct outcome. But she finished the conversation with Sotharn and crossed the atrium, and she crossed it toward him, which he had not expected. She stopped in front of him. Your disciplinary review, she said. It was resolved. I know, he said. The statement helped. Thank you. She nodded. I read the full report, she said. You moved in 9 seconds. I didn't count. The security system did. She paused. That is very fast. You were exactly where I thought you'd be, he said. That made it faster. She looked at him. You know my habits. I'm observant, he said. It's part of the job. I notice where people are. She was quiet for a moment. My father noticed where people were, she said. He said it was the most important skill in diplomacy. Knowing where someone actually is, not where they're supposed to be. He didn't say anything. He just waited, in the way she had come to understand he did, making space. I have been somewhere else for 14 months, she said. I think you may have noticed. Yes, he said. I think I have been coming back, she said. In increments. Slowly. She paused, and then something happened that no photograph captured, because the photographers were on the other side of the atrium. The phosphorescent traces beneath her skin produced light. Not gold, not the full warmth of uncomplicated joy. Something smaller and more considered, a trace of warmth in the branching lines beneath her jaw and at her temples, the bioluminescent equivalent of an ember catching in a hearth after a long cold season. And her face moved. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile that doesn't announce itself, that arrives at the corner of the mouth and in the slight change around the eyes and in the quality of a pause. Quiet. Honest. Real. She said, my delegation departs at 0600. I know, he said. Ours departs at 0800. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, I prefer things honest. I know, he said. Then I'll say this honestly, she said. I'm glad you were on this station. I'm glad you read the briefing packet. I'm glad you make 2 cups. He looked at her, and the light was soft in the atrium, and whatever his face was doing, it was doing it without any attempt at control. I'm glad I was here too, he said. She nodded, once, and turned, and walked back into the work of the evening, and the light under her skin was still there, faint, but present, and it was there when Thevrak saw her cross the room and went very still, and it was there when she shook hands with the Torati representative and managed the necessary diplomatic fiction of cordiality without losing anything essential, and it was there when she looked back, once, across the atrium, briefly. He was still there. The summit ended at 2100. At 0600, the Meridian Accord undocked from Kirin Station and moved toward the transit point for Delos Prime. In her private cabin, Sorvath sat with the data pad in her hand and the star field moving past the viewport, and she was reading a file. Not a briefing. Not a treaty. A book, a human novel, fiction, about an expedition to one of Jupiter's moons, from a digital edition she had downloaded from the station's library before departure. Thevrak knocked at 0700 and found her still reading. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The traces beneath her skin were quiet again, she was concentrating, not feeling, but they were quiet in the way of before sleep, before thinking, not in the way of grief. He knew the difference. He had spent 14 months knowing the difference. We have dispatch waiting, he said. I'll be there in a moment, she said. He paused. The human novel, he said. She looked up. He said the author got the science right, she said. He was correct. Thevrak stood for a moment longer. He said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. He had served her father for 20 years and her for 14 months, and he understood what it meant when a person returned to themselves after a long time away. He withdrew and let the door close quietly. Sorvath read for 3 more minutes, then set the datapad down, stood, smoothed her formal tunic, and walked through the door to the dispatch room, to the work, to the endless threading together of things that needed to hold. Her father's work. Her work now. The work of the next 40 years, if she was very fortunate and very careful. She thought, for a moment, about a person who made 2 cups. She would send a message through the diplomatic channel. Nothing that required a response. Just an acknowledgement, honest, the way she preferred things. She would tell him the novel was good. She would tell him the science held up. That would be enough, and it would be honest, and it would carry what it was meant to carry, which was, I came back. You were part of why. The stars moved outside the viewport, and the compact held, and she walked toward the dispatch room with her head up and her pace steady and the smallest possible trace of light moving beneath her skin like something kindling in the dark.